Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to session 2 of our training series on the impact of child toxic stress. A couple of things before we get started today. As you can see there on your screen, the session has been approved for 1 CLE credit hour. Please give us at least 30 days to submit that CLE to the CLE office. Remember, you've got to be logged in for the entire course of this webinar, and answer the poll questions. We will also send out continuing education certificates within 30 days as well, if you indicated that you needed that. In our chat, we have links to today's PowerPoint, as well as resources for today's PowerPoint. OJA's website, or should I say the Kansas Supreme Court's website, is back online as of today. Right now, we don't have the links to materials up yet, but those will be up within a couple of days, so you can check there as well. If you've got questions, please add them to the Q&A. Any questions after this training, please send them to tcs@kscourts.org. And don't forget to fill out the evaluation. We'll be sending that out. It will come from Trial Court Services. That will be sent out on Tuesday. Please send out, complete that evaluation. That will help inform future webinars. And for today's main presenter, we have with us Mary Kelly Pearson, who is founding attorney and principal of Pearson Law and Policy and vice president of legal affairs for the Boys and Girls Club of San Francisco. Pearson's law practice comprises her services to the Boys and Girls Club as in-house counsel and pro bono service as amicus counsel to the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. She founded Pearson Law and Policy in 2015 and has worked to advance the profession's understanding of how toxic stress and childhood trauma impact the life outcomes of affected youth. Pearson earned her bachelor's degree with honors from UCLA and her MA and PhD degrees with honors from the University of Washington. She is also a graduate of Columbia Law School, where she was a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar and editor-in-chief of the Columbian Human Rights Law Review. She served as a judicial law clerk to the late Judge John T. Noonan, Jr. of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Welcome back, Mary Kelly Pearson.
Good morning. I'm going to share my screen so we can have our slides. Good morning and welcome. As Lana said, I'm Mary Kelly Pearson. I want to thank Lana and the Office of Judicial Administration of the Kansas Supreme Court for having me back. It's just a pleasure to be here. I want to especially thank you for being here. Child trauma, toxic stress, and structural racism are all really hard topics to talk about. And when you put them together with the question of juvenile justice system involvement, it just gets that much more complicated. So thank you for being here today. This is a very tight agenda, and I want to draw your attention particularly to a special expert guest that we have with us today. I want to thank Dr. Miriam Jernigan-Nuesi for joining us at the end of today's session to address questions. I'm hoping, as Lana said, that you can put some of your questions into the Q&A as we go forward, and that Dr. Jernigan-Nuesi will join us later around 35 past the hour to talk about as many of those questions as we can get to. And so thank you, Dr. Jernigan-Nuesi, for being with us today. We begin today with a question. Why is there such a marked racial disparity in juvenile justice system involvement in Kansas and across the nation? And so the hypothesis that I'm going to suggest today, joining many others, is twofold. So first, as we saw in November, child trauma and toxic stress increase a child's risk for juvenile justice system involvement. And second, Black, Latina, and Indigenous children in Kansas and across the nation are significantly at higher risk for child trauma and toxic stress. And today we'll delve into why. By the end of today's hour, we hope that you'll be able to define interpersonal and structural racism, including the concept of racism without racists, define race-based traumatic stress and describe its impact on children's life, health, and learning outcomes. and describe racially disparate rates of suspension and expulsion, the correlation with juvenile justice system involvement, and correlation to racially disparate levels of toxic stress and race-based traumatic stress in childhood. Let's take a quick look back at session 1 from November, which was Basics of Child Trauma and Juvenile Justice System Involvement. So welcome and welcome back to those of you who were here for session 1. So wonderful to have you here to spend a day with us. We talked in November about some very challenging topics, adversity, racism, and we delved a little bit into race-based traumatic stress. And if you weren't here, welcome. If you did, welcome back. Quick recap of what we talked about. We took 2 hours to explore the basics of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and toxic stress. And we talked about the original ACEs study, which was a cohort of adults reporting on whether or not they had experienced 10 particular experiences before the age of 18. And that study found that there was a dose-response relationship between exposure to a number of traumatic incidences and life outcomes, health outcomes. And we did talk about something that's really important. I want to repeat it just for folks who are new today. ACE scores are a public health tool. They're retrospective, and they evaluate the health of a population and not an individual. So I want to just repeat that ACE scores are, do not please add up your ACE score and make any conclusions from that ACE score about your health or your lifespan. If you use your ACE score personally at all, it should be with your primary care doctor so they can help you evaluate. We also talked about how traumatic experiences and toxic stress impact brain function and development and can affect physical health. So a child impacted by trauma and or toxic stress is likely to be more reactive, self-protective, and defensive than a kid who hasn't had those experiences. The fight or flight response can bypass the brain regions that engage higher level functions, and the ensuing reactions and the coping mechanisms can cause significant difficulties. And today we'll talk about what that looks like in school again. So, and finally, we talked about researchers who have expanded the concepts of ACEs and child toxic stress. This is really important. This is the work that was done in part by the Philadelphia ACEs project. The original ACEs study looked at the within the four walls toxic experiences, as we talked about in November, and the expanded ACEs work looked at stressors that would happen outside the home, like racialization, racism, discrimination, community violence, poverty, and others. Importantly, the Philadelphia ACEs study found that about 11% of that particular cohort experienced expanded ACEs, but not the ACEs that were looked at by Kaiser CDC, which means that they would be invisible to traditional types of studies. And that invisibility is one of the things we mean when we talk about structural racism. This is a slide that we looked at in November. Kansas disproportionately incarcerates youth of color, and we know this is also true across the nation. So these disparities persist in Kansas, but elsewhere as well. And I would note that in my home state of California, youth of color are 300 times more likely to be arrested for simple assault. Simple assault and minor infractions in school particularly are two of the things where you see these disparities begin. So Lana, I think you are going to be administering this as a pretest. You will see the same two questions at the end of today's session. So take a moment and provide your vote. When you're ready, we can move on, Lana.
Sure, Daniel, we're ready for question 2, please. And everybody please answer question 2.
Okay, so in this first part of today's session, we're going to look at some key definitions so that we all have a similar understanding of what we mean by some of these words that are really core and central to the analysis here. So the idea of race, now there's a lot of definitions that you could use for race. This is the one that I've selected. But this definition, the idea that the human species is divided into distinct groups on the basis of inherited physical and behavioral differences, has for the most part been recognized as a fiction. So the physical, biological, physiological distinction that some concepts of race in the past assumed was true is actually false. It's a fiction. It doesn't have any biological validity, but it has tremendous social and political power. And that's what the concept of racism, racialism, or racialization recognizes, that belief that humans may be divided into separate and exclusive biological entities called races. Now, if you look at our constitutional legal structure, it recognizes the fiction with the concept of equal protection, which created protected classes not to give them special rights, but to declare that these protected classes, the individuals who are members of these protected classes, have the same rights, access to which had been historically blocked by discrimination. Concept of structural racism is a bit different. So while racism is commonly thought of as an interpersonal dynamic, someone is a racist, someone does a racist thing to another person, someone says a racist thing, structural racism is a very different way of thinking about racial inequality and the impact of it. So this is a definition used by a researcher published in The Lancet, which is a medical journal. And this definition identifies structural racism as the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination throughout mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, criminal justice. There's a lot of different ways in which these systems interact. And those patterns and practices in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs and values and distribution of resources. We've all been impacted where we live and work and play. The definition on the slide highlights the mutually reinforcing nature of that structural racism and some of the reasons why it becomes invisible. The medical profession in particular has been working to understand how structural racism relates to health inequities as a way of improving public health. And again, think about ACEs as a public health measure. The medical profession therefore has recognized that the invisible forces of structural racism actually have a heavy impact on the health of people of color. Linda Villarosa, a health journalist and New York Times reporter, published a book last year that delves further into this key example of structural racism. Let's listen to a few minutes of an interview with her on PBS NewsHour's Story in the Public Square. Just before the excerpt, Villarosa is talking about how she used to believe that health and other disparities were a function of individual responsibility. She pursued that idea quite a lot as a health editor at Essence. And that responsibility included hard work in her view. But then she said her mind was changed by her work in medical journalism and public health when she was a fellow at a school of public health. In fact, the first chapter of her book is titled, "Everything I Thought I Knew Was Wrong." So she's in the position of a lot of us of like having had that concept and then digging further into the facts and understanding how different they actually are. She highlights in this interview, prior to the excerpt that we'll hear, the fact that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die or almost die than white women when giving birth. And a Black woman with a master's degree actually has that risk to a higher degree than a white woman with an 8th grade education. Let's listen.
You know, those are staggering statistics. One of the things that, and they're very contemporary, one of the things that struck me from your scholarship and some other places too, though, is that this is not, the disparity in outcomes is not a new story. And in fact, you document some really barbaric practices that where principally white physicians and white scientists experimented on African American populations throughout America's history. Can you tell us a little bit about that history and how it manifests itself today?
Well, I'll start with, I got this information doing research for the 1619 Project. My essay was on medicine. And I was very surprised at how bad it was during enslavement, just because I had never looked at that history. And the ways of sort of experimentation were framed around the idea that Black people had very high pain tolerance, so that we could tolerate pain that no white person could ever deal with. And that was a way to justify all the cruelties that went along with enslavement. I think I studied the through line and took the through line from, 250 years of slavery to present day, and was looking at studies that asked physicians to be, so medical students, interns, and residents, about different myths, sort of that Black skin was thicker than white skin. Black people had more or fewer nerve endings, difference in nerve endings, and also that Black people could tolerate more pain than white people. And something like 40% of medical students, residents, and interns believed at least one of these myths, which is very dangerous, because that means that they're going into their practices thinking things that Black people and white people are somehow genetically different. And it's interesting because I think about the title of my book, Under the Skin, and that's what it means, that there is something that happens, whether it's belief, whether it's the way we're treated, that goes beyond, and it's more than skin deep.
So, Linda, do you have a sense of why those myths, for lack of a better term, persist today in 2022?
Well, I think that they haven't been, they're still in medical books sometimes, like there are medical books and in medical training where some of the myths still exist. One of them is about kidney function. There's an idea that Black people have different kidney function than white people. And there's a race correction that still exists. So it corrects. So like I got my kidney function test not long ago, 6 months ago, and there was a white reading and a Black reading. And the Black reading was circled for me because of I'm Black. And I thought, wait, how do they don't know anything about me except my race, and I get a different reading. Also,
People come from.
Villarosa goes on to talk about the fact that the lung function numbers also differ between Black and white people. And so those are good examples of ingrained misconceptions in medicine that are examples of structural racism. Those demonstrate the persistence of racism independently of interpersonal racism. And it's not that interpersonal racism doesn't exist, but that it also exists in systems and structures that have durable impact on racialized people. And so Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who you see on the slide, named this phenomenon racism without racists, and he uses it to explain the persistence of racial inequality in so-called colorblind world, the one that we think we want to have. If many mechanisms that reproduce racial inequality in the United States are invisible, then they become self-perpetuating. And I believe, and the OJJDP of the justice system also believes, that it's our job as justice system workers to try to see them and root them out. Race-based traumatic stress is another really useful concept in this context. And so this is, earlier I had mentioned this term, and the term names the injury suffered by racialized people as the result of their racialization caused by race-based negative treatment or experience. And so when measured as an expanded ACE, like I mentioned the Philadelphia ACEs project doing, RBTS emerges as a distinct source of toxic stress. And so what I'm interested in today in talking with you about is how RBTS caused by systems and structures and just the way things are always done, the way systems run in default, actually has a durable impact on kids that end up in the juvenile justice system. And I want to extend the analysis of RBTS back into the work we did on the impact of toxic stress back in session 1. So how extensive and how common is race-based traumatic stress? A study published by the ACOMA project last year found that it's quite common among youth of color, as you can see on this slide. 42% reported exposure to at least one source from police, teachers, or employers. And in the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology, a researcher demonstrated the results that participants reported, and these are children of color, over 5 experiences of racial discrimination per day. Doesn't seem to add up with the prior slide, but this could be any kind of experience that the respondent identified as racism and not necessarily race-based traumatic stress, but it's very common. I would love to give you a moment to talk to each other, to put it together and talk about how race-based traumatic stress impacts your practice or how you've seen it. Unfortunately, we're not in the same place and we should probably move on, but I would love to give you an opportunity to reflect if we were together, because this is a really important, I think, indicator of some things you may be seeing. So how does race-based traumatic stress impact educational and life outcomes in terms of attainment, suspension and expulsion, and involvement with the juvenile justice system, which is ultimately what we're here to talk about? We talked about this a bit in November, about the physiology of toxic stress, how it affects the HPA axis, how it affects potentially brain development, the way the brain works, the way it reacts to stress, the availability of brain function to pay attention to higher order cognition and thinking, as opposed to reacting to a perceived threat in the moment. So these are some of the ways that that kids can actually have that toxic stress interfere with their experience of school. Higher order thinking and perspective taking, sequencing, problem solving, organizing, task orientation, remembering instructions, and especially important is the controlling emotions and behavior. That reactivity and impulsivity, the aggression, the withdrawal, those are all potentially symptoms of overexposure or unmanaged exposure to stress and to toxic stress. An implicit bias can shape how adults interpret those results, regardless of who the child is. Those, as you can see just from this list, particularly memory and the ability to organize tasks and have access to that part of the brain, would have a significant impact both on the ability to learn and on the ability to stay focused and not misbehave, and therefore not be removed from class or from school. The school to prison pipeline is a concept that is, I think, key to understanding a lot of the disparity that we see in educational outcome and in juvenile justice system involvement, both in Kansas and across the nation. This is universal. This term really describes policies and practices that directly and indirectly push youth out of school. So we know that suspension and expulsion actually they're like a gateway to later trouble for the child, including a much higher rate of referral to the police and a higher rate of juvenile justice system involvement. So some examples of the way the school to prison pipeline works universally is the increased presence of school resource officers and police officers in schools, which can result in those professionals being assigned tasks that they haven't been trained for. So for example, if you have police officers in schools handling defiance or other kinds of misbehavior, as opposed to the principal or a behavioral health specialist at the school, there's a much higher risk that that child will end up having a police encounter and a juvenile justice system encounter. So I've provided here a couple of sources that provide more information about how this looks in Kansas. And so the lower quote here is actually from the Kansas Beacon on November 12, 2021. In the same Beacon article, it said the Kansas schools refer Black students to police at a rate twice the state average and 3 times the rate for white students. And that disparity in referrals to police matters a great deal over time. So the minor infractions that I mentioned are definitely problems that interfere with classroom management. They are certainly issues that teachers need help and support managing. Absolutely. The thing that the school to prison pipeline lens encourages us to see is that handling minor infractions with a school resource officer, or by referring directly to, say, for example, the principal's office, where the principal might use the tool of suspension to respond, is something that actually is very detrimental to children's long-term academic success and ability to stay in school, and also detrimental to their ability to stay away from police contact. There's important research that's recently come out that Dr. Jernigan-Nuesi can comment on in a bit about the risk of escalating police contact that disproportionately affects racialized youth and especially Black youth. And that's an important part of understanding the way that this sort of default structure or structural racism operates in schools. The people who are most affected are really some of the groups that this trauma and toxic stress series is focusing on. So one of the questions that we received after session 1 is whether we're going to do a session that focuses on students with disabilities. Unfortunately, we are not going to do that this year, but I hope that Kansas OJA will choose to do that in a future year, because students with disabilities, and especially students of color with disabilities, are disproportionately impacted by suspension and expulsion and juvenile detention. Black students are 3.8 times more likely to be suspended than white students. LGBTQ students are a great deal more likely to end up in that situation as well. Session 3 actually focuses on LGBTQ students and toxic stress. Suspensions, expulsions, and criminality are incredibly increased by suspension and expulsion. And so you can see that students with even 1 suspension or expulsion are 3 times more likely to enter the juvenile justice system the following year. There's a lot of reasons why that is. There's plenty of people in this virtual room who know a lot more about that than I do. But what seems quite clear is that if you connect the dots from toxic stress to reactivity, impulse control, trouble focusing, trouble learning, to referral and suspension, to arrest, you can see how that connection of the dots could potentially be interrupted, be intervened in by a different way of managing students who have suffered a lot of toxic stress. It's certain that this is a racially disparate practice. The reasons why, perhaps we could talk more about, but certainly the disparity is very clear. The rates of suspension for first-time violations are significantly higher for Black students than for white students. So what we really want to dive into in the Q&A, which is coming up pretty soon, and I know that this has been a lot of information and a lot of dots to connect without necessarily a lot of facts and evidence. It was important to us today to connect conceptual dots and then leave a lot of time to discuss how those look in practice, how they look to you, and what, if you would like to delve into it, what the facts and evidence underneath them are. But the basic question is, how do race-based traumatic stress and racism impact the racially disparate rate of juvenile justice system involvement, and what do we do next? What we can understand and explain, in other words, we can prevent. Theories explaining racial disparity in juvenile justice system involvement basically come in 2 kinds. There's differential offending and there's differential treatment historically. But if we take a step back, it looks a lot more, that picture becomes a lot more complex. We can think more about the systems, the interactions, those default measures, the sort of invisibility of our systems that shapes and constrains and directs our youth. The lens, if we shift the lens in that direction, can remake the way that we think about and support living wages, schooling, access to healthy food, childcare, medical care, and the juvenile justice system. Only that last item is the one that we actually participate in and can intervene in and affect. That's true. But the holistic view of the way that children participate in society, the way that they experience toxic stress, and how that toxic stress impacts their life outcomes is something that absolutely requires a holistic and 365-degree view. So I wanted to share with you a quote from the Office of Juvenile Justice at the DOJ. This is in the literature review, the DOJ literature review, which is in the resource list, which you'll receive. The National Research Council in 2013 said, with a complex social problem such as racial and ethnic disparity, numerous factors are likely at work, including poverty, segregation, educational challenges, residential instability, and the broader racialized society in which many institutional practices, public policies, and cultural representations operate. It simply is not enough. Like, racial and ethnic disparities are not reducible to either differential offending or differential selection. So there's more going on here than what our approaches have traditionally encompassed. And that's really the message that we wanted to get across today, that race-based traumatic stress and structural racism interact to influence, to leverage that racial disparity that we see in juvenile justice system involvement, and that there's definitely things that we can do to intervene and to work to better that system. I wanted to, let's see, give you a moment. This is kind of another step back moment where what I would love to do is have you turn and talk to the person next to you. If we were in the same room, we're not, but I want to give you just a moment to think about this information, the way that we framed it. What are some of the most important implications for your practice? And then we're going to go back to do the quiz again real quickly. And then we're going to go right to Q&A live with Dr. Jernigan-Nwesi. So in this next couple of minutes, please take a moment to consider what we've just been talking about. Think about if you have a good question that you'd like to ask Dr. Jernigan-Nwesi and me, and please put that in the Q&A. And so I'll give you maybe a couple minutes. And please keep in mind while you're formulating a question and considering that if there's material from the first session, if you didn't attend the first session, or if there's material that you want to review more thoroughly, please feel free also to ask questions about that. Okay, Lana and Danielle, why don't you put up the quiz review, and then we will dive into questions after that.
Okay, let's go ahead and end that poll.
Thank you.
And then let's do the second question and we'll share results. Okay, let's go ahead and share results, please. So Mary Kelly, you can see the results of question one. Are those, did the majority get the answer right?
So it's 3.8 in the particular data set I referenced on the slide. So it should be 4 times more likely if you round up from 3.8. So that should let everybody know kind of where they were with that one.
Sure. And let's go ahead and share the second questions.
Okay, this question, I realized I didn't reference the specific study for you in the presentation. It is in the resource sheet that we'll share. True is the correct answer. So there was a recent study done in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools that was a pretty neat control that involved students who were transferring between schools from a less strict to a more strict school defined by suspension rates. And it turned out that the schools with higher suspension rates and more disciplinary strictness did lead to greater involvement in the juvenile justice system. So thank you, Lana, for that.
You bet.
So we're going to go to Q&A. I'm going to introduce Dr. Jernigan-Noesi. And Lana, should I stop sharing my screen?
I think that's up to you. I think it's probably fine to continue sharing. You have about 15 minutes left in the webinar.
Okay, great. Dr. Mariam Jernigan-Noesi is a clinical and research psychologist, one of whose areas of great expertise is race-based traumatic stress. She completed an advanced internship at the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology at Boston Medical Center and Boston University School of Medicine. She also completed postgraduate fellowships at Harvard Medical School and Yale University School of Medicine, and provides a range of counseling to a very diverse range of patients, and also completes research and trains students. And so she is a nationwide expert on race-based traumatic stress. It's an honor and a pleasure to have Dr. Jernigan-Noesi with us today, and we are going to go through some of the questions. Welcome, Dr. Jernigan-Noesi. Would you like to say a couple words to open?
No, I think just thank you for having me.
Okay. Let's have a look at the questions.
Yeah, so I think there were a few questions, some sort of pertaining to the role of school-based resource officers and their training, other questions with regard to data, some of the data that you presented and how updated data can be obtained by folks. I think and there were some more questions that were just added. I can certainly start with some resources for folks with regard to just paying attention to the trends, especially as they highlight some of the disparities that were noted in the presentation. I'll also make note of the fact that in terms of looking at the dates of publication, they're always going to seem like they're a few years off because we are looking at data right from previous years. But the U.S. Department of Education certainly has robust statistics as well as data that you can look at nationally as well as in some cases geographically. So there may be Kansas-related data that certainly the U.S. Department of Education might publish. I have found it's been really beneficial to identify and really locate some of the foundation or sort of policy institutes that tend to have more up-to-date data and more specific data, particularly in certain geographic areas. So organizations like the Urban Institute or even the Learning Policy Institute are a couple of kind of foundational resources that also provide that data with regard to student experiences, disparities with regard to discipline, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that there's an interesting question here about the training of teachers, staff, administration, and SROs. I cannot speak for Kansas. I can speak for California a bit. And I know that Dr. Jernigan-Noesi can speak for other geographies. It really varies. I think that, in higher resource schools, there's certainly more behavioral health support and fewer SROs, fewer police officers in schools. Police officers tend to be more frequently present in schools of low resources. And by low resources, I simply mean in part school funding, also community support. That is also, it turns out to be a racially disparate impact, right? Because most urban schools that are mostly racialized children are low resource schools. They're Title I schools. That's where we tend to find more police officer involvement. And the training piece is really important. I think, one of the things that I've heard from police officers and SROs who are assigned to schools is that they don't have the behavioral health training to be able to de-escalate kids, to be able to, interact with them in the way that a counselor might. And so they use the tools that their training has provided for them, which is much more likely to be detention and arrest. And that goes in the inevitable direction. And so that's just something for all of us, I think, to consider. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a large range of resources on its website, which are excellent, that are about creating trauma-sensitive schools and trauma-sensitive environments. And so that training, where it's available, is incredibly helpful for schools. There's a couple that I can put into the resource sheet that you can read about that have instituted trauma-sensitive tools and have really found a sharp decrease in suspension. Things like push-in, where a teacher needs help with a student's behaviors and is able to call a colleague who's extra, right? So that's part of it. It's like you have to have extra people, extra behavioral health people, especially on hand, who can come in and assist the teacher by assisting the child, instead of having an SRO come in and remove the child to a place where perhaps arrest is going to be a problem. So that's a reflection on the training. I do think that resourcing for behavioral health instead of resourcing for law enforcement in schools is really important in reducing the suspension and expulsion that we've seen is so racially disparate. Dr. Jernigan-Noisy, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if you sort of look at the national standards for school resource officers in particular, I do think it was, for me, noteworthy in learning more about SROs and looking at some of the emerging research and data that indicate some of the concerns about having SROs, particularly in school-based environments, is that their sort of baseline mandatory training equates to that of becoming a law enforcement officer. So it may vary depending on the state, but in fact, if you look at some of those national standards, in essence, one actually has to complete training to become a law enforcement officer, right? So if we sort of think about what that training looks like relative to the points that Mary Kelly highlighted, I think that becomes and is a critically important conversation that we're having now.
Thank you. There's an anonymous attendee who asked a question, why is the media focused on Blacks only when there's a larger Hispanic population and many other races who have issues in discrimination? Great question. I think that my experience of the media is that they actually do, when I was doing research for this presentation and previously, there's actually quite a lot of resources out about Indigenous children and the obstacles that they face. There's a lot of Indigenous kids in Kansas and in California, which is my home state, and certainly studies that look at those obstacles for Latino kids as well. In California, I know we have a lot of research on toxic stress and trauma and school experience for kids who are immigrants. Who are Latino immigrants. And so that I want to validate the question. It's a very important question. It's very valid. And also to say that we certainly do have a lot of material. Dr. Jernigan-Noisy, I'm sure, could teach a whole college course on what we've just done in this hour, more than that. And so there's only so much time, but I want to pass the mic to Dr. Jernigan-Noisy.
Yeah, I think that the question, duly noted, I think it's also complex. I can't really speak to why the media focuses on particular things. I would agree, though, that the information is available more so than I would say even a decade ago. I think part of the issue in terms of how we're gathering information also includes who and how it is, right, that we're soliciting information with regard to how individuals may self-identify, which would allow us to further disaggregate the data, which then can become highlighted, right, in media settings. So I would encourage folks, and which is something that I tend to do, is to certainly take and to sit with the information that is being presented and to operate from the perspective of, as opposed to the tendency that we sometimes have to compare against racialized folks of color in particular, to really think about, right, sort of the themes around racism and the different levels which racism may exist and persist, be they for Black identified youth and students, Latinx youth and students, as well as Indigenous students, and as well as other students or youth of color. So two things. I think I always encourage folks to really think about the data and how you're gathering data that would further highlight, right, and enlighten us with regard to our conversation today, but also know that some of that data exists. It is just a matter of looking at other sources beyond the media.
Yeah, thank you. I think that Patty Davis has put a resource into the chat, a local resource, more detailed guidelines coming out next year. She said it's a PDF, Missouri model of trauma-informed schools. And so that whole area of research has been really interesting and has been very revelatory. And I hope that the folks have some time to look at it. There's a key piece here, I think, there's a lot of things that go into making a trauma-informed school. Part of it is simply awareness on the part of teachers and behavioral health specialists and others at the school of what trauma looks like and how, what are some good ways and interventions to help a child who's evidencing traumatic symptoms. But there's also a lot that can be done with school curriculum to support kids, to help them feel psychologically and emotionally safe. And that can also be a resilience builder. And so in that light, there's a lot of research that we have on ethnic and racial identity and how that, when installed in curricula in schools, can be very helpful to creating that trauma-informed, safe environment. Dr. Jernigan, did you have, I see Lana.
We have just about 5 minutes left,
Yes.
6 minutes left.
I want to give Dr. Jernigan Nwesi an opportunity to add a comment if you'd like, or a closing comment. And again, it's such an honor to have you here, and we really appreciate your presence.
Absolutely. I was actually just scrolling through some of the additional questions. There was one that caught my attention earlier that I wanted to speak to, but I can't quite locate it specifically. It was more about sort of thinking about schools and the training. And also, I think it was a question by Susan Quinn. In terms, yes, this is actually the sort of comment / question with regard to encouraging teachers to work with caretakers, right, directly, so they can be in partnership for helping a student who needs extra help dealing with their stress-induced behaviors that keeps a student from interacting with their peers or focusing on the classroom lessons. I think that the reason why this particular question / comment caught my attention is because I want to highlight, I think, Mary Kelly's perspective with regard to the ability to think about individual or interpersonal interventions, I think, is critically important. But I also want us to also think about the role of the system in this case, right? Or this example, it might be thinking about schools, right, as systems. And so while we are also thinking about advocating, working with caretakers or adults in the lives of youth, I often think from a very multidimensional and sort of comprehensive standpoint, in what ways are we also preparing school systems, administrators, leadership, educators to identify and understand, right, some of the externalized behaviors that they may be seeing that may be a result of toxic stress. So I find often actually that, caretakers, adults in the lives of youth, including parents, are interested, are invested, but there is a disconnect between the communication between systems and their ability to engage and consistently engage caretakers or caretaking environments. So I do think it's important to really think about that encouragement in terms of communication, but I also would push the envelope a little bit more and ask ourselves, how are we also thinking about the structural aspects of school systems and how they may actually be contributing to the stress that youth are experiencing in those systems that then lead to some of the behaviors that get identified and punished, quite frankly, in school systems.
Thank you so much. And we have about 3 minutes left. So I'm going to quickly look at what session 3 will bring for you. Child toxic stress and LGBTQ identity and discrimination. We are going to look at why LGBTQ youth are at a higher risk of environmental factors, which then leads to the toxic stress risks that we've discussed and arrest for status and nonviolent offenses. So while LGBTQ youth make up about 5 to 7%, depending on where you are, of the population, they're 13 to 15% of those currently in the juvenile justice system. Again, we're going to ask the question, why is that? And what are some possible ways that we can intervene? And I really appreciate you spending your time with us today. Thank you so much. I really hope to see you for session 3 and also for 4 and 5, which will address the foster care system, and then some systemic considerations, a trauma-informed approach to child welfare and juvenile justice. So thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Jernigan Nwesi, for joining us today.
We do have a couple of minutes left, so we do want to make sure that folks do remain on with us so that we get the full 50 minutes of CLE credit. One thing I did want to make mention of, a couple of slides back, Ms. Persine had on the date for May 26th, thank you, for 10 to 10:50 a.m. That's actually noon to 12:50 p.m. here. So noon to 12:50 p.m. here. Registration for all of these sessions will be included in your evaluation. Please don't forget to fill that out. That will be sent from our office on Tuesday from Trial Court Services. And any other parting words? We do just have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I didn't, I usually cut it exactly right. And this time it was 2 minutes early. So I apologize to everyone, but I do want to remind you that on the OJA website, you can access the PowerPoints for both session 1 and session 2. So particularly if you didn't join us for session 1, please do have a look at that PowerPoint, and there's a resource sheet for that first session. And there's also a resource sheet for this session along with a PowerPoint. And I encourage you to go explore those resources, have a look, do some reading, for those things that spark your curiosity. And please do send us your questions. We will be responding in writing to many of the questions that you may have currently that we didn't have an opportunity to address today.
Yes, that sounds great. And many of you may already know this, but the Kansas Supreme Court's website was down for some time. It is back online as of today. However, they're having troubles with PDF, adding PDFs to the website. And so the PowerPoint for today's session and the resources for today's session are at the top of the chat. We will get the PowerPoint and resources, agenda, etc., all on our website just as soon as we can. And we are at the 12:50 mark. So thank you very much, ladies. It was just an honor to have you. And we look forward to seeing all of you, or having all of you back with us on May 26th for our next session, which deals with LGBTQ folks. So thank you so very much.